when it comes to peace around the world, or lack of in some cases. I actually think that having Trident as a deterrent is, you know, in an ideal world you wouldn't need it, but in the world that we live in, I think we do need it. Do you?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Let's hope it remains a deterrent and is never, ever used. I mean, I think it's fair to point out that these people signed this early day motion in the House of Commons in 2021. Quite why it's come into the Daily Mail today, I don't know. I can only assume because it's some sort of a bit of mischief making. But they were signing a thing called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which Britain doesn't support. NATO doesn't support, so I'm not entirely sure why that's appeared in the Mail. But I agree with you, Michelle. Yes,
do you think we need Trident?
I think we do need Trident, and I think you can't trust Labour on defence. I think it's as simple as that. We don't know what... Labour has been very quiet about their defence policies. We don't know what they do, and we don't know whether they would keep the nuclear deterrent and renew the nuclear deterrent, which is, of course, what is necessary, because Trident itself is getting a little bit old. And that will be a big, expensive item. So I think they need to be clear. I'm not holding these guys to what they said 2 years ago. They've had the chance to deny it. They could have denied it and said, our thinking has changed. They haven't said that, as far as I know. But I just don't trust the Labour Party generally. Whatever they said 2 years ago, I wouldn't trust them today.
In the interests of balance, let me read out what a Labour spokesperson said, that its support for nuclear deterrence was total, adding it provides protection to our NATO allies as well as the UK. Under Keir Starmer, Labour's support for NATO, our nuclear deterrent, the UN and our armed forces is unshakable.
But he's reversed every pledge he's made.
That may be the case. I just think in the interest of balance, it is only fair, given that we're in well, we are in, coming up to some by-elections, so some balance would be quite good. I find it interesting as well that you say you can't trust Labour on defence, because many people watching this at home will push back and say, well, hang on a second, because it's the Tories that, for example, have diminished a lot of the armed forces. There was a report out the other day in terms of the standard of equipment that we've got, for example, in the army, the number of the personnel that we've got in the army, and that's happened. The diminishing of that's happened on a Tory watch, not a Labour one.
Yeah, there's a real question going on, which, again, we haven't heard Labour engage with, about what sort of armed forces you need for the future and how much of it is actually heavy weaponry and men on the ground, boots, I shouldn't say men and women on the ground. How much of it is that, and how much of it is a more modern way of fighting? Now, all of that thinking that was going on has been reversed in a way by what's been going on in Ukraine, because Ukraine has been a war which has been all about heavy weapons. And so there's a lot of thinking going on about this and what the size and shape of the armed forces should be. I think they probably have been cut back too much. I think the government should spend more on defence. But we have a lot of competing pressures as well. There are other things we should spend money on. We can't spend money on everything. You
mentioned NATO. No, you can't spend the money on everything, by the way, but defence, for me, would be pretty right up there.
Defence is pretty high up for me.
Top priority spending, if you ask me. NATO, you mentioned NATO.
I keep thinking you're trying to turn me off with that thing.
No, this is not a random remote control. It's a very high-tech piece of equipment. I can't tell you what it is, because sometimes we have to keep secret.
If I explode, we'll know why.
I'm waving it energetically at Joe. NATO, of course, Lithuania.
Yeah.
We've just seen Rishi Sunak, or I think we can just see Rishi Sunak. He's just arrived for that talk. When you hear about NATO, of course, you've got conversations at the moment about whether or not Ukraine should be admitted. Zelensky, he's not happy at the moment. He says that they should be allowed in. There should be a better and quicker and more effective timetable to allow that, and etc. Where do you stand?
Well, I can understand where President Zelensky's coming from, and I'm sure he's very impatient. He wants to do it, but the conversation started. Actually, it was sort of extended an invitation by George Bush in 2008, but NATO is very clear. It expects a certain standard of behaviour of the countries that it admits to that very exclusive club, and that is about the governance in its own country. And there were big questions about the levels of corruption in Ukraine. Now, what has come up today, actually in the last half hour, is that the NATO Secretary-General, the outgoing Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, has come up with something that looks like a reasonable compromise, which gives a sort of a one-step, as opposed to a two-step, accession for Ukraine, but with no date on it. In other words, we're going to keep supporting you, we are going to support you, with whatever you need, whether it's weaponry or diplomatic efforts or whatever. But you can't.
What's the point in NATO then? Because if you're going to go to what you're saying is we're going to do. NATO saying, oh yeah, we're going to do all this support for Ukraine. But if Ukraine is not a member and you're saying, oh, NATO's going to give it all this support, what is the value in being a member then? If whenever someone in conflicts outside of NATO is going to get, to quote you, all the support.
Because if Ukraine had been a member of NATO and Russia had still invaded Ukraine, we would be at war with Russia, because the whole point of NATO is that everybody supports each member.
Well, you mean, are you on about the Article 5, which is essentially the attack on one is attack on all, you'd have boots on the ground.
Yeah.
Then that brings in Moylan's point, Daniel's point, which is about actually what does conflict look like? Because whilst we're not at war, boots on the ground with Russia, there's no denying that we are one of the forefront players when it comes to financial assistance to Ukraine, weaponry, arms, all of those kind of things to Ukraine as it stands at the moment.
We are, and thankfully Boris took a lead in that and led the world on it, led Europe. I think the question of Ukraine joining and what's been said today, I think Ukraine will be bitterly disappointed by what's been said today, because although Joe tries to sort of big it up as something, in fact it isn't very much. They're going to carry on training them they're going to train them on aeroplanes. They're going to have a council. A council is going to meet between... They've already got a commission. They're just changing the name from commission to council. I think they're going to be very bitterly disappointed by what's been decided today. I personally believe you can't admit Ukraine to NATO while a war is going on. But I certainly think now that whatever you would have thought before this war, if Ukraine succeeds in getting the Russians out, which I greatly hope they do, then Ukraine needs to join NATO.
Well, there you go. What's